to that, but we can't order an independent one done.
I'm suggesting that we need to see the value of this property that we purchased, and my suggestion is that we ask for for an independent third-party assessment of the value of that property in that market.
Yeah, that's not something that we can, again, order the government to pay for and have done. If you're asking for, if there's an existing one, we can ask for those an existing documents, but we can't order the government to spend money to have a consultant. Maybe GC Strategies is available to do it, but we can't order that to be, sorry, we can't order that to be done.
I'm not suggesting that we order them to spend money. I'm asking that there be there is very likely an assessment that was made as part of the purchase. But that's my amendment, my sub-amendment is that after the official residence of the Consul General in New York, including if available, an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market.
Who are you? Sorry, I'll hand it over to Mr. Bear and then Mrs. Vignola. But I want you to clarify, Mr. McKinney, who are you proposing does this independent? Because the committee can't order, even if we pass a motion, we can't order the government to perform an independent audit. We can ask if there's evaluations of it, or we can ask if there was one done. We can ask for those papers, if that's what you're asking for.
The language that I just said is that, and include, if available, an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market. That does not order the government to spend any money, but that is my sub-amendment.
So just to be clear, the sub-amendment to produce these documents if it exists.
If available is what I said. I think it's important that we understand the value of the property. This is not an expense.
So if there was an independent one done, we can ask for it if it exists. Not if it's available, if it exists. We can order it, the production of it. How's that? Are we on the same wavelength now, Mr. McKinnon? Basically, if one was done, we'll order the production of it. Correct?
I'm going to say I don't really like you rewording my motion or my amendment, but I will reword it a little bit. I'll say to add after the purchase for the official residence of the Consul General in New York, comma, and request, if available, any third-party independent assessment of the value of the property in that market. That should deal with your concerns.
Bear with us 2 seconds, Mr. McKinnon. Just making sure our clerk has what you've been asking for, Mr. McKinnon, so everyone's clear. Just going to read it back. The clerk's just going to read it back to Mr. McKinney. If you could let us know if we've collected it correctly from you.
So after New York, comma, add and request, if available, any independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market.
Yes, that will be sufficient.
Can we add within 21 days so we keep it with the same for the other documents?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Did you still wish to speak on this, Mrs. Vignola? Okay, Mr. Barrett. Mrs. Vignola, and then Mr. Barrett. And then Mr. Brock.
Bon. Très rapidement, c'est
Just very quickly, it's much more clear now. So if the government has carried out an analysis, we would like to have it. I think that was already included in the original wording where it talked about the documents, but sure, we appreciate the clarification.
Thanks, Mr. Barrett, then Mr. Brock.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with Mr. McKinnon that this is not an expense. His words were that this $9 million is not an expense, that $9 million in a cost of living crisis, in a housing crisis in our country, $9 million on a condo for Justin Trudeau's buddy Tom Clark on Billionaire Row, that $9 million is not an expense. Well, was it a gift? Because if it, where did the how did that purchase come to pass? I mean, just absolute fantasy along the lines of budgets balancing themselves. Of course, $9 million is an expense, and it was taken out of Canadians' pockets. It was taxed off of their paychecks. So, of course, $9 million is an expense, and I'm pleased that the chair did heavily coach the amendment, because in its current form, it's supportable, though it wasn't in its original form. But we want all of the information about this $9 million expense that taxpayers are footing for the luxury condo for Justin Trudeau's buddy Tom Clark, living on, quote, Billionaire Row in New York City. And I hope Mr. Clark enjoys it until the day after the next election.
The concern that I have, if anyone, I'm sure we've all dabbled in real estate in our personal lives, if not professional lives. There's always a cost attached to any assessment of fair market value. No, I understand that, Chair. I just want to complete my thoughts. There's always a cost to obtain an assessment. So in the ordinary course of events, the Liberal government, an agent of the Liberal government, would have negotiated the purchase of this extravagant, ultra-luxury penthouse on Billionaires Row for $9 million. There may or may not be an assessment that was made privy to the agent who purchased the property on behalf of the Government of Canada. But unless it's in the government's possession, even if one exists, the author of that assessment, unless they are a very generous individual or company, is highly unlikely to release it to the government to comply with this order without a cost. So unless the Liberal Party of Canada, which is in a position to pony up for a potential expenditure to comply with this particular order of committee, my concerns are it should not fall to the taxpayer.
Mr. McKinnon, is your hand up? Or is this just from the previous?
Yes, I just wanted to quibble about Mr. Barrett's comments. It's a purchase of a liquidatable asset. It is owned by the Government of Canada. It can be sold at some point, and presumably the value recaptured. It is definitely not an expense by any acceptable accounting process. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, and I also would suggest that we should ask or invite our witnesses to leave if they don't want to stay.
Well,
No.
maybe save that for your committee, Mr. McKinnon. I'm sensing we're getting close, so I'm hoping we might be able to get one more round in with the witnesses, because I want to hear more from them. Are we do we need to vote on Mr. McKinnon's sub-amendment? 'Cause it sounds like, I think we're in a general agreement with basically providing those documents if they exist, as the clerk has read back.
We should send a green book over to his committee.
Yeah. Are we fine with that? Do we need to vote on it, or can we accept it as, I'm sensing we are accepting it. Unanimous consent. We are now back to the original, now amended motion. So we're back to the amendment. Do we need to, are we fine with this? Wonderful, that is accepted. So, and we're back now, the sub-amendment, amended motion. Are we fine with it, colleagues? Yes. Wonderful. I am glad we did not dismiss our witnesses. We are back to our speaking order. And no, I'm sincere because I'm finding the time with Mr. Boots and Miss Clark fascinating. So I'm very, very happy that we can have them for a bit longer. We're back to, actually, Mr. McKinnon, you are up now for 5 minutes with Professor Clark and Mr. Boots. Go ahead, sir.
Excellent. Well, it turns out I'm glad we didn't release them as well. Dr. Clark, you mentioned a number of countries who have this problem nailed. I wonder if you could give us kind of the top 3 in order of how they would be most useful for Canada to model.
Yeah, I don't know if I can kind of rank the top 3 like just off the top, but I'd say when I look at countries that are generally succeeding in the quality of their digital services and their digital modernization, vendor management and IT kind of contracting is a big part of their strategy, because like clearly the answer here is not for everything to be built in-house. There's lots of room, and there has to be room to have healthy relationships with these outside providers. So I mentioned a few examples of countries that are doing interesting work in this space. I'll offer up a few that come to mind. I know in Singapore, and speaking with a public servant there who works on their digital government initiatives, they have a practice of making sure that whenever they work with a larger vendor that may not be local for a local firm, that they have like clauses in the contract which say that they have to bring along local firms to kind of give them the opportunity to work on a government project to help sort of infuse more local economic development and foster a really strong local tech ecosystem. I think on the point around bringing in strong tech talent, we talked a fair bit already about sort of the issues of like just the salary disparities. And so countries that are succeeding at bringing in that kind of talent to senior roles are taking some of the measures that Mr. Boots mentioned around, not strictly forcing these people into managerial roles when that's not where their passion and talent lies, but also really emphasizing the kind of the public mission of government. This is something that comes up constantly in interviews with technologists who choose careers in government despite the lower pay, is that it's like really rewarding and meaningful to actually improve your country and help people get services that work. So pushing that message is really powerful and has worked very well in the United States, for example, and in the United Kingdom in bringing in technologists. I think thinking about, we talked a bit about the problems of revolving doors and, like sashaying from a career in government into these firms and that creating opportunities for perhaps sort of like inappropriate contracting. I also think we really want to nuance that to note that we do still want to encourage a kind of fluid interchange between the private sector and government, acknowledging that it may not be realistic for those who have lucrative opportunities in the private sector to work an entire career in government. So making it easier to have more of those interchanges and building up a really strong culture of like seeing those outside players as not strictly the enemy and having strong rules and good organizational hygiene internally so that when you do have that back and forth, that you don't worry as much. You don't need to be as concerned about conflict of interest or cronyism. This comes up, for example, when I was speaking with public servants in Estonia, kind of globally recognized digital leader, they see the boundary between public and private as pretty fluid, and partially that's because they are a tiny nation and it's a small community, but when I ask them, like, well, aren't you worried about those folks like leaving government and then using that to get career, like, to build the profit of a firm? And they say, we all know each other. We have a high level of trust. We have strong rules in place and a very strong culture of good governance. So these are some of the things we want to focus on building in Canada. I think there's tons more. The spend controls that I mentioned, I think, are needed in this case, just as a hard stop on bad practices. That's another one. And yeah.
So Singapore and Estonia. Singapore is a small island. Estonia is very small. The problems, seems to me, the problems there are quite different than dealing with a large country like Canada, with our vast geographical areas and communication issues and so on and so forth. Do you really think that those countries provide a solid model for us to follow?
That Mr. Boots, yeah, go for it.
Sure, yeah, if I could jump in. There's some other really interesting examples that relate to the question of who owns the software that's being built through government ID contracts around intellectual property and the use of open source software that different countries have done really interesting things. And a couple of examples of this that are maybe a bit more comparable to the Canadian kind of geographic and sort of context are both Germany and France. The government of France, maybe a decade ago, in legislation declared that essentially all technology products bought and used by the federal government or by the national government in France needed to be open source. And the term open source, I think, often makes you think of, geeks in the basement of a university, like in the basement writing code. But open source software is widely used by the private sector tech industry, by governments and universities and organizations all around the world. And it helps get around the situation where you bought a product from a commercial software vendor that only they provide, and then you're just stuck with them for decades, which often happens with government technology products, where we spent millions of dollars on a product from one vendor, and getting away from them is too difficult because they're too entrenched. That's a systemic problem that shows up a lot. And so France has legislation that says, when we're paying companies to build software for us, it needs to be reusable. It needs to be licensed under a sort of agreement that lets other departments in other parts of the government or other countries even use it. So that's really important. And Germany has recently launched what they call the Sovereign Technology Fund, which is essentially government funding to build digital software products that can be reused across the German government and across other governments around the world, so that you're not paying for the same software over and over again. And there's this idea that just like bridges and airports and ports create sort of an infrastructure on which the economy functions, government-owned or open-source government-used software creates an infrastructure layer that lets services be delivered more efficiently, at a lower cost, more reliably. So there's a lot of interesting work happening to make software reusable. And I think for Canada, you could imagine a future government introducing something like a Don't Pay for the Same Software Twice Act that sort of enshrines this idea that if we're paying for some company to build a brand new piece
I
of
have to
software
ask you to wrap up, Mr. Boots. Sorry.
No problem.
Thanks.
It's a topic I'm a little bit too passionate about, so I appreciate the question a lot. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
When we bring you, the two of you back, if you'll come back, when you produce your paper, I think we'll do an extended meeting just so we can have some more time for this. We're going to do our final set of interventions. I have Mr. Barrett for 5, please.
So, Ms. Clark, when we left off, I had asked you about ministerial accountability, because we have seen a situation where situations like the Trudeau Liberals Arrive scam saw companies like GC Strategies, a 2-person operation working out of a basement, adding no value. Supposedly, they were to source resources to work on the project, but we learned from KPMG, which is a huge company, that KPMG was instructed by the public service that they would need to be a subcontractor of GC Strategies, adding 30% to the cost of it, and there would be many of these cases. So, is the problem that no one is in charge anymore, and so there's no one actually trying to evaluate whether we're getting value from these contractors, big or small? Because as you said, though the larger companies are the most successful in winning the bids, they're not necessarily providing the best value for money. And value for money is a whole other conversation that we'll save for another day, because there are far too many cases where, as the Auditor General has noted, we don't get value for money with the Trudeau Liberals procurement process.
Mm-hmm. So I think like the point around holding ministers to account for these kinds of failures is really important, and something that we've seen in other jurisdictions where we've had massive change in thinking about how to work with vendors and how to manage digital initiatives more generally. It's usually because there's been a big political scandal and somebody's like was on the line, who, you know, someone and was held to account, and there was a clear point of ministerial kind of ownership. This is a challenge in the Canadian case in that we have muddied ownership of all these questions, right? So you've got, first of all, many departments involved, like Public Services and Procurement Canada, Treasury Board. Now we have the Minister of Citizen Services, Shared Services. ESDC is an owner of many of these, you know, so how do we, like, to move beyond just a specific question of what happened with ArriveCan, I mean, when there is a kind of an IT failure, it can be really hard to locate, like, who to blame, but also who's then sitting around the cabinet table feeling like I'm responsible for and I own this. When we had a Minister of Digital Services in the past, we no longer have that role. I'm not sure that was necessarily the answer to this problem, but one thing that I think would be important to think about in sort of future machinery of government configurations is like, how do we create a clear locus of responsibility and accountability that is like answering questions in question period and actually can access the information they need to be responsible? Because this is, of course, the other challenge around ministerial accountability on this particular file is that their ownership is so distributed and the decisions are happening on so many different ways that it's really hard to know who would be reasonably blamed for these things.
Well, and they shuffle the deck chairs on the Titanic so often that it's hard to know whose seat is whose. They've had 4 PSPC ministers in 4 years, so it's really tough. They've created a situation intentionally to make it harder to hold individual ministers to account. And this Prime Minister has established a system where no one is held responsible in spite of their failures. He doesn't fire the ministers when they break ethics laws, and he doesn't fire them when they fail Canadians. You know, there's a list of 2-person middlemen companies like GC Strategies, and there seems to be dozens of them. Solutions Moray Incorporated had 2 employees. They've got $78 million in contracts. Mesa Computing, 1 employee, $34 million. Mobile Resources Group, 1 employee, $28 million. Access Corporate Technologies, 2 employees. They got $9 million. Hackett Consulting, 1 employee, $8 million. They must have been really working overtime. What real value have they provided to Canadians for these hundreds of millions of dollars? Isn't it easy to say that they've provided no value?
You know, I think I don't
brief
know
answer,
what each
please.
of those firms has done. I haven't looked at the individual contracts or what their deliverables were, so I really can't comment on the value for money. But I will say, sort of looking to the patterns we saw in the data, that we have very good reason to believe that the kind of pooling of contracts in a small number of firms, and also the general practices around how we manage IT procurement suggests that there would not be value for many of the IT contracts that we're striking, just even at the basic level of how much money is going into each of those individual contracts.
Thanks. Sassy, please go ahead for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to share my time with MP McKinnon. MP McKinnon.
Thank you, Mr. Assassi. So I want to talk to Mr. Boots about earlier on in the meeting we heard that projects too big to succeed are our problem. We need smaller projects, particularly with software. And you emphasized that it's not so much about the projects, but about the contracts. We need smaller contracts. in less than $3 million, or sorry, less than $2 million or so, and 3 years. So it occurs to me, though, that this kind of sidesteps the issue. If you have a large project in which you have some number of smaller subcontracts, that you still have a large project, and someone has to define that project. Someone has to analyze the components of it, and then allocate those. So is this not? Creating a whole number of subcontracts with, of less than $2 million and so forth, doesn't really solve the problem. We will probably have a larger overall project that is substantially more.
Yeah, it's a good perspective. I think it's, in some ways, that's sort of an illustration of the internal, the burdensome barriers that exist for public servants that are trying to get a procurement or an RFP out the door. It is so much work and so time consuming to go through all of the sort of paperwork steps to get there. And that's one of the reasons that public service teams are so incentivized to, instead of having 5 small contracts, they'll just have one enormous contract with one of the really large vendors, who then will probably get a bunch of subcontractors and do work that's really hard to keep accountable. I think breaking things into smaller contracts, like Professor Clark spoke about, is a way of being more accountable to if those contracts are actually delivering good value. If it's a contract for $2 million for 6 months for some team and they do a bad job, you can drop them and move to the next vendor. Whereas if you have a 5-year-long contract for $30 million with one company, even if they're doing a terrible job 2 years in, you're probably still stuck with them because it's too hard to extricate yourself. And so breaking the thing into smaller pieces, into smaller contracts, is a way of improving the quality of outcomes. And around the sort of overall cost of even large IT projects, I think one of the things that the private sector technology industry shows us is that you can have a massively popular product, software product, used by millions of people for like a fractional cost more than if it was only used by a few people. So, for example, if you're the team that launched Instagram 10 or 15 years ago, you probably had a team of 5 software developers. You built Instagram. The cost of running that team that built Instagram is the same if it had 2 people using it or if it had 300 million people using it. And the only differential cost is a little bit of cloud sort of computing infrastructure that doesn't really cost much money nowadays. And so the team of people building it is the most expensive part, regardless of how much it's used. And that way of thinking really hasn't internalized itself into government software, where the idea is this is used by millions of people. We need a 1,000-person team of contractors working on it. And the truth is, you could build an equally high-quality product with a team of 10 or 15 at a fraction of the cost. And there's some great writing from Waldo Jaquith in the United States. I don't know if we've mentioned his work before, but he has a great piece about Scrum team years, which is around this sort of assumption that a large IT project in government surely must cost $50 million. And his question is, what are you actually getting for $50 million? A lot of paperwork. The team that's actually building the software that people will use, you might need one team. That might be $1 million a year. You might need 2 teams. That's $2 million a year. The costs are actually much lower than people are accustomed to in government IT. And there's just this normalized idea that it's a large project affecting a lot of people. It must cost a lot. And it's hard to question that when that's this sort of established thinking on these types of projects.
But you're still not committing to a large project that is substantially more than $2 million. And within that context, it's going to be up to the vendor to decide how to manage it, whether to break that down into small sub-projects.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the thing that is a sort of cautionary tale once you're trying to break a large project into small ones is this idea of false incrementalism. And sometimes you see an idea where you'll take a large project and you'll say, here's phase 1, here's phase 2, here's phase 3, here's phase 4. And the question that anyone in a leadership position should be asking is, when we did that, is it still useful if we only ever did phase 1 or 2? If we still just stopped there, would it still add public value? And of course, if you're delivering software on a regular basis and actually shipping it out the door for the public to use, to get feedback, for people to actually benefit from it, then it's still useful after only 1 phase or only 2 phases. But if it's a 5 or 10 phase project that's only useful at the very end 5 years later, you haven't actually broken it down, you've just given little labels to it. So actually shipping something out the door for the public to use, that's the real defining factor between genuinely breaking things into smaller pieces or false incrementalism where it looks like you did, but it's not actually benefiting the public.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Clark, in 2022. Oh, I'll let you put your earpiece on there. Thank you. In 2022, it was estimated that at least 7,500 people working for the government were earning at least $14,000. I believe it was you who came up with those numbers. Some were earning $2,800 a day. First question. Do these salaries reflect what is done in the private sector?
So, do public sector salaries reflect the salaries that private sector consultants would make?
Dans le fond, les 7 700 consultants informatiques.
The 7,700 IT consultants are consultants. They were hired by the government, and they earn, on average, $1,400 a day as contractors. If they were working for a private company, would they be earning that same daily amount, or less, or more?
I don't actually have the data on that to know what the average sort of consulting fee is for private sector. I think it's a good question though, right? To investigate whether it's like more lucrative to work as a consultant with government versus contracting with a private firm. One thing that we did find really interesting, and the Auditor General has been helpful here, was in bringing out some of the sort of trying to understand like how much we pay on average a day for a contractor versus an in-house government employee, and it is quite striking actually how much more expensive it is. Again, it's not to say that everything should be in-house, and there's nuance there on some roles like should probably be in-house, like a product owner, for example. I've mentioned Finland a few times. They don't have any coders in-house. They just outsource all of that. So there's an efficiency of like what type of role as well.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, vous avez répondu à ma.
Thank you. You anticipated my second question. Federal public servants are not paid those huge amounts. When you look at the difference between a public servant and a contractor, could you explain that difference in payment by the fact that there could be a number of in-between levels?
Pause the time. We're just having issues with translation.
Oh.
Yeah, no problem there. Are the differences between salary differences between consultants and public servants, can they be explained by the fact that there's a number of different layers of subcontractors who are saying, I'm going to pick this guy, he's going to pick that guy, and everyone adds money onto that total? Could that make up the difference?
I mean, possibly. We didn't look at that. We didn't have data around that in our research. So it's a good question. Mr. Boots, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Yeah. One difficulty there is that if there's a per diem for consultants, part of it would go to the company itself. It's really hard to say what amount of money goes to which level of the process, if there is a process with multiple levels, as you were saying, between the company hired and the person doing the actual work. Thank you. Very quickly, Ms. Clark, earlier you mentioned that people who are skilled in programming and IT are not necessarily interested in becoming managers and signing paychecks. But would they be interested in becoming technical managers? So people who are specialized in contracting. Basically what I'm saying is, should there be two levels of manager, technical ones and HR ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think we looked at it in terms of the career progression in the private sector and what's, you can continue to move up through the ranks in a tech firm, for example, getting, more seniority, better pay, while still doing the technical work. Whether your point is sort of, if I'm understanding, whether there could be like a sort of more technical managerial route versus, I mean, I hadn't thought about that. And Mr. Boots probably has, or at least has thoughts on how that could be operationalized based on what you've seen with your colleagues, because you did work, he worked very closely with tech talent in government that could have, run off to the private sector as well.
Yeah, avoir ces deux trajectoires.
Having those two career paths, HR manager on one path and IT manager on the other. Well, I think that would actually be a step in the right direction. Also, IT is varied. There's the help desk in there. There's low-level employees, and then there's people who are hyper-specialized in very specific things, like cloud computing, for instance. Within IT, in the public service, we need to review the classification system. Software developing specialists and cybersecurity specialists should be handled in one way, and then more traditional IT, like the help desk and team management, could be managed a different way. It might be advantageous to split the IT classification into. This would help with hiring, for example, and ensuring everyone has competitive salaries.
Blaney, you're batting cleanup for us today. The floor is yours, please, to finish us off.
Well, thank you so much, Chair. I appreciate that. I think this has just been so fascinating as a member who isn't often on this committee. I really have to say I've really enjoyed what I've learned. One of the questions, and I'm asking both of you because you both have different expertise on this issue, is finding that right balance between in-house and contracting out. I mean, that's come up a lot. And I'm just wondering, how should we consider that being measured? What do we need to assess in that process? Because I think, I will say for the public service, like they are on the precipice of defending taxpayer dollars and how it's spent. This is obviously not going very well right now. So I'm just wondering, what kind of policy do we need to really find that balance of in-house, and what is the justification behind it? Because I think when we look at a lot of these issues, the problem is, until there's a crisis, this is very hard to explain to people who vote in our country. And we want Canadians to have a better understanding of why we're doing what we're doing when we're in government. And so if you could give us a little bit of thoughtfulness around that, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's like some nuance, and I don't think there is a clear rule yet on like what the ratio is between in-house versus outsourced, and there's different approaches. As I mentioned, some governments really emphasize a sort of fluid back and forth. They don't really, their focus is on kind of a core of IT expertise in particular roles. So the product ownership role is one. So is something that is sort of regularly cited to me as something that needs to be brought in-house. I think senior leadership and empowered sort of proven technologists who've like produced high quality services and like putting those folks into kind of deputy minister rank positions where they can actually influence how the rest of the work in their department unfolds. That seems to be an area where focusing on in-house is really, really important. I think there's like scope to think about across departments, like how you could kind of, we work right now with the Canadian Digital Service as something we haven't talked about yet today, but that is an important tool that we could greater kind of use across the federal public service to bring in tech talent. And so many governments start out this journey of reskilling or upskilling by creating these small digital service teams at the center. And then over time, departments create their own digital service teams. And the idea is that you can pass on these methods and try to kind of retrain internally. But there is no golden rule for how much of the work should be sent out to others to do and what should be kept in-house, with the exception, as I say, of regularly the product ownership role comes up. And then I would say the other one that regularly comes up when I speak to public servants about this issue is that they feel very strongly that sort of policy, vision, strategy, the objectives of a digitization initiative, that should be internal. And then the kind of the footwork can be fruitfully outsourced. And then that there's certain other areas where it's just not going to be reasonable to keep that expertise on hand, like the latest expertise in artificial intelligence or cybersecurity. This might be something where we want to kind of turn more to external advisors, but have a sufficient base of knowledge internally to be able to ask good questions and really scrutinize the advice they provide.
Yeah, I think sort of adding to that, I think the two kind of principles, kind of regardless of what that ratio is, and I think we agree that it should be at least considerably more in-house tech talent than the current ratio. But I think regardless of what the sort of perfect ratio might be, I think the two principles that to me come to mind are, for technology products to succeed, you need better feedback loops. And part of that is public service culture, where it's really hard from the ground level on up. It's hard to share bad news up the chain. You can imagine stories about Phoenix where people, with their hands on the keyboards were like, wow, this is totally going to blow up. And of course, as that goes up the chain, it gets watered down every time, where, the project manager above them is like, we're dealing with some issues, but it'll totally turn it better. And the layer above them says, aside from a few things, it seems great. And by the time it gets to deputy minister, it's glowing green lights all across the board. And so figuring out ways to sort of short circuit the lag time and the telephone tag that happens between, the technology folks doing the work and the decision makers 8 or 9 layers above them, trying to short circuit that, I think, is really important. And the other angle is, like Professor Clark mentioned, around ministerial accountability in technology products in the federal government. It is so diluted and so diffuse, where any given project has so many external dependencies. And so that's, for example, you've got the team building the product, you've got their contractors, you've got shared services doing some things, you've got TBS needing to get reports on other things. And it is so hard to say, here's the team that's ultimately accountable at the end of the day, here's the director, here's the ADM, here's the deputy minister, here's the minister.